Mike Barra is an engineering consultant for major aerospace companies for more than 25 years. His first book, Dark Mission: The Secret History of NASA, was co-authored with renowned researcher and lecturer Richard C. Hoagland and was a legitimate New York Times bestseller, making me not too jealous, Mike. The compelling subject of Mike's lecture is the title of his book, Dark Mission: The Secret History of NASA. Please welcome me in giving a warm welcome to Mike Barra.
Okay, thanks very much. We're just going to wait for the, do I do this, or do they launch it? Yeah, 1 minute. All right, we're going to launch the PowerPoint here pretty soon. I was going to start by saying I was really surprised at how much of, how many things I'm going to talk about were actually in the previous lecture by Farah, and hold it closer, okay, by Farah, and there's actually some symbols and things I'm going to talk about, but what we're going to really discuss is sort of an occult, esoteric influence inside NASA, and we're going to do some other things too related to, I guess the best way to describe it is extraterrestrial archaeology. If you've ever listened to Richard or seen any of his lectures, listen to him on Coast to Coast AM, you know that that's his shtick, is that there's stuff out there on the moon and on Mars that NASA found a long time ago, at least as far back as the 1960s and maybe even before that. Okay, so I work with Richard on the Enterprise mission, which is his website and sort of his institute that he uses to do different types of research. And I got involved with him about 10 years ago, and my main focus was on what we call the ritual alignment model of NASA's behavior. And as I get through this lecture, I'm going to hopefully explain that to you in detail. What it really amounts to is that NASA is not what it appears to be. It is basically a secret society in of itself. It was dominated by members of secret societies, and these people had a very specific agenda when NASA was formed. In fact, it may be in fact that NASA was formed for the very specific reason, to go to the moon and recover evidence of whoever lived there before, a long, long time ago. Our book, as I mentioned, is Dark Mission: The Secret History of NASA. This is the new cover we're going to put out on the next edition. It looks like we're going to do a special edition next year, a very small run of a better version with better pictures. One of the compromises you have to make in a book like this, it was 550 pages, is that sometimes the pictures don't get to be as big as you'd like them to be, and they don't get to be as high fidelity. So we're going to put it out with full high-resolution images and things like that people can really see, because a lot of this story is visual. And our tagline at the bottom there is, "The lie is different at every level." And what that basically means is kind of what Farah was talking about, and I think what some of the other lecturers are going to talk about, which is that everybody in this hierarchy thinks that they know what's going on. And the truth is they've been lied to by the people above them. And it's a sort of a giant pyramid scheme. And what our task is to try to figure out, from the perspective of NASA, is what is the truth behind all the lies that they've been telling for 50 years. Okay, this whole thing started, and I apologize if you already know the whole history of Mars and Cydonia and all that stuff, but I have to assume that the audience doesn't know this history, so I have to go through it. It started in 1976 with this picture. This is called the face on Mars. It's just a sort of a mesa in the middle of an area called Cydonia on Mars, and this picture was taken by Viking 1 in 1976 on July 25th, which is actually the anniversary is coming up. And what happened was a NASA scientist named Toby Owen looked up and he said, hey, look at this, guys. And the next day they held a press conference, and at that press conference Gerald Soffen, one of the project engineers for Viking, said this. He said, "Isn't it peculiar what tricks of light and shadow can do? When we took another picture a few hours later, it all went away. It was just a trick, just the way the light fell on it." Well, that was a lie. And really, that's the first time, I think, that people begin to question seriously whether NASA told the truth, not just about this, but about anything. Because the fact is, there was no picture that was taken a couple of hours later. They should have known that, because the planet continues to spin underneath and the probe continues to orbit around this way, so obviously they weren't anywhere near Cydonia, plus the fact it was dark at that time and they couldn't have taken a picture. So this kind of went nowhere for about 4 or 5 years until a guy named Vince DiPietro and a partner of his named Greg Molinar at the Goddard Space Flight Center decided to let's go look up that face on Mars picture. And they did, and when they found it, they also found another image. This is 70A13, it's another image taken about 35 days later, and a higher sun angle, about 10 degrees higher, and it shows a little bit more of the right side of the face. This is a processed version of the first image, 35A72. So again, just to go back here, look at how much better it got when professionals started working with it. Here it is, the very first NASA processed version, and then as we go forward, which I didn't plan on doing, this is what happened when Dr. Mark Carlotto eventually got a hold of it in the mid-1980s. So it started to look a lot better. It had a lot of features that maybe made it look like it might be a sculptured object. It had apparently 2 eye sockets that were pretty well balanced. It had a mouth. It had some suggestion of nostrils. There's something that looked like they might have been teeth, and those turned out not to be teeth. But basically it had a symmetrical platform and a lot of things that suggested that it might in fact be constructed. Well, my partner, my co-author, Mr. Hoagland, got involved and formed 2 separate independent organizations that were dedicated to researching the subject and the question of whether the face itself and Cydonia in general had artificial structures on it. Eventually they found some items like the city over here is a collection of pyramid or pyramidal mountains that appeared to be possibly artificial. There's a huge object called the Dnn Pyramid after DiPietro and Molinar. It was named after them. That has a vaguely pentagonal shape to it, a bunch of other odd stuff. The cliff, a very, very straight line that looks like it was sort of constructed on top of an ejecta blanket from a crater, and another object called the Tholus, which is a very round mound. All these things are in conflict with each other in terms of geology. In other words, there's reason to think that they're artificial just based on looking at them, a lot of their characteristics, but even more than that, they don't agree with each other. So whatever could have formed this thing, and actually there's nothing that could have formed that naturally, but whatever could have formed the DNM or the face would not be the same process that would have formed something like the Tholus. So they all appeared to have different geomorphic characteristics. So what we're going to look at first is the city, and Hoagland called it the city. Had a lot of different features identified within it, especially this thing over here, the fortress, which appeared to be sort of a triangular-shaped building with an internal wall at about 60 degrees. And then there were these little objects that are called mounds that appeared to be sort of arranged geometrically. Now, if you look at the fortress a little closer, what we expected to see was an internal wall. When we got better pictures of it later on, it turned out that there wasn't any internal wall, that it was all, in this case, a trick of light and shadow. But one of the things that's really interesting is that in order to get a shadow like this, a triangular shadow, you basically have to have a triangular peak. So this is an object that someday I want to spend some more time studying, because it looks to me like it once had a triangular base. It appears to have been inundated on the side, and I think it might be a collapsed tetrahedral pyramid, and we'll get to that later on. Here's a quick morph of the Mars Global Surveyor images versus the old Viking of the fort, what we thought it looked like and what it now ends up looking like. Some of the other objects, the cliff is very, very strange. It's this sort of bizarre, very straight ridge. There doesn't seem to be any really, it shakes a lot too. There's an earthquake. Very, very odd shape to it. And are we okay? Okay. The straight line like that is really, really unusual in nature. Later on, we've got more pictures of it from Mars Odyssey 2001, right over here, the Mars Global Surveyor, where they managed to miss part of it in high detail, and then Mars Express, a color image, and it just continues to look really bizarre. It looks like it was sort of pasted on top of this flow over here, which again would suggest it's possibly artificial. The other object that's really interesting here is the Tholus. This thing is a round mound. It's very similar to some earthen mounds in England. It has sort of a moat or trench around it. It has a couple of layers. There's a little opening right here, which may or may not be an entrance. Mark Carlotto did some three-dimensional projections of this original Viking data, and it appeared to have sort of a little peak on top of it. So there were reasons to think that this stuff might be artificial, and there was all kinds of people involved in these early investigations. Now, early on, they developed some ideas about there being possible relationships, mathematical relationships between some of the objects. For instance, there seemed to be a proportion. If you took one measurement being from the outside edge of the city to this thing called the city square, that was 1 unit. If you took that and then started looking, and you had 2 units would be the edge of the fort, and then 4 units would be the face, and then over to the cliff, and 1, 2, 4, 8, that kind of thing, which kind of made them think that perhaps there was something more to this. But the really, really interesting, intriguing object was this one, the Dnn Pyramid, which basically appeared to have a pentagonal shape.